What a Wild Spirit Brings by Lil, Chapter 39. She picked her way carefully now, over even more difficult ground than the crags and stumpy evergreens which the mountains before had yielded. Here the wood was ancient, brush crouching against the ledges, as if trying to hide away from the filtering ashes clogging the air. There were deep piled boulders, the granite weathered by eons of weather, and now blackened by the poison of eternal dusk in the air of Sheolum, beating against this side of the mountain, tearing at it, as if the mountain was a fortress under siege. There were exposed rock faces, with narrow cracks, faults, and fissures. It was like a skeleton of a mountain on this side, like decaying stumps of rock, and worse were the trees. There were weird, stunted things growing tortuously out from piled boulders as if trying to escape, all short and yet all hundreds of years old. Their age and wisdom was not enough to save them from Sheolum's taint. The soil was too poor, the mountainside too tumbled. The trees could not combat the dark force of this black air assaulting them, and they writhed and twisted from the bombarding of evil, interlocking with each other incestuously, striving against a force they could not defeat. While the soil was poor, the air was hot, rich with char and dryness. The ground was a slick of wet decay, like a film of wet blood pouring from the wounded mountain. Here mosses and lichens luxuriate, staining rocks over and over, maculating with writhing trunks with a myriad of colors of decomposition. Fragile ferns grew, pale fleshy parasites clung to the limbs, sucking the slow sap with hollow tongues, advocating the advance of the noxious Sheolum. Lil tried not to think about it, tried to remain focused and disregard the atmosphere of mystery and antiquity and putrescence. There was an undeniable air of something deep and old, the leafless wood breathing with an ancient evil. Munchen followed her. She gave him the last bar, the last of the food Tamrock had given her, what felt so long ago, after only an hour of descent. He shoved it almost whole down his mouth, still laughing. She had no idea how he didn't choke. Dark-winged Monsol were flying over the mountain, she realized. Where there were Monsol, there were Kurik. She really was going to die. She deserved it for Liv, but she still felt fear as she came ever closer to Sheolum, the blight on the continent, the gaping wound on the world, bleeding, ever gray. Munchen suddenly shoved past her, almost knocking her off a cliff. She gathered herself and saw that he was running to meet a group of some 50 Kurik with open arms. They ran toward him. He was ranting about North and Glowies at the top of his lungs through his mad cackling. Lil turned and found nowhere to hide behind her. To the west of the cliff was cliff, so she started east. She had hardly gotten past the crest before she heard his madness silenced with a shriek of rage. Then there were other cries. She actually stopped to look back, hearing him laughing again in the distance, but turned and ran. There was no saving him, and apparently he really was taking some Kurik with him. She ran for only a quarter-mile before she fell to her knees, gasping. She was so tired. She was in snow, so getting further from Sheolum, but that wouldn't save her. She couldn't hear them, but they would be after her, and she knew it. How to escape? Was there any escape? Did she deserve to escape? She looked around her and saw a long rock. It was totally flat and leaned against another as if it had fallen from it. She got up, body stiff, and dragged it over to the edge of the steep slope, huffing, her muscles feeling shredded. She forced herself to believe this was safer than Kurik. She slipped over the crest of the mountain, sliding down on her makeshift sled, and tried not to think that she was going to die. She could vaguely hear Trixie laughing behind her. She could see Mitten ahead, down at the bottom, with a picnic waiting, and Gimp running alongside her with flowers in her hair. Ashen was dancing on her lap, and Tamrock had an arm around her. She could hear Mina clapping from somewhere with Jelena, her baby cousin. Somehow her mother was suddenly there, reaching out to her, bleeding, arrows in her. Lil let go of the rock to reach out to her and felt herself fly from the moving object into the snow with shattering agony cascading through her with each blow as her body rolled to a stop. It took her a while to regain her wind, and when she did, she looked up and found herself at the foot of the mountain's eastern side. She had no idea how she had gotten there, weariness numbing her thoughts, but to her left were the vast reaches of Sheolum, and to her right was another mountain. Forward was a little area between the next mountain and this one, covered in sweet snow. Amazing, she loved that, but it was preferable to the ashes fluttering in from Sheolum. She stumbled up and could hardly walk. Her body was screaming at her, but she pressed onward, her mother walking beside her, bleeding and smiling, and Ashen at her feet, cooing at her. She hadn't gotten far before it started snowing. She remembered from her hazed thoughts the snow-covered tracks. She couldn't think why that was important, only that it was. She could hardly think at all. She knew she had to keep moving, even though pain and exhaustion was consuming her. She had to put her foot forward. Good. Now pull the other one up. There. Now again on this side. Suddenly she was falling. Then all was black for a moment, before she was in the court. She could feel her hurt and tired body as if it were far away. The cold was gone. The suffering was gone. She started laughing for a moment from sheer relief. The wilder. Once out of the hedges, she found she was in a hole on a rock that laid across an expanse of darkness. She didn't want to know how far down it went. She needed to find a way out. Then she remembered the 50 curragh and dove up and out of the hole and started grabbing up brush and covered the hole, then moved snow across it. It was still snowing, though here in the wilder it was neither cold nor white, but she didn't know how close the curragh were, and would this even be a good plan? What if they walked over the hole and fell in with her? She tried to formulate another, but she finally dropped to herself and gave herself a sword. If they found her, she could at least feel like she had a weapon. Lil made herself a meal too, warm and thick venison pie, like Tick and Mina had made. She made a flask of warmed milk. Light. She knew it was all here in the wilder. She would wake up cold and hardly able to move, but she had to pretend a little. She had to try to lift her spirits. She decided she had to wake up or she might die in body and be stuck in the wilder forever. She braced herself for pain and dropped into the circle. Her eyes opened and she moaned loudly. Her back hurt. It hurt badly. The snow was cold on her skin, falling down on her from so high up. Moving all the brush in the wilder really hadn't worked. Part of her had almost thought it would, that she'd wake up with the hole covered. Lil was about to start weeping when she realized she could smell food. She turned her head slowly and saw pie lying next to the sword and flask. She couldn't believe it. How? She reached over, despite how her body ached, and grabbed the pie, cooling quickly, and then drank the chilled milk. The air was so cold, but even lukewarm pie was warm compared to nothing. It was really real. The food was really food. But how? Lil opened her eyes again. She closed her eyes again. She hurried in the wilder to the top and found the hole was again how it was in the real world, but now there was an empty pie dish and a flask next to her and that sword. Was it because she had used brush already there to cover the hole? Was it because she had created the other objects? She made herself a thick quilt and then woke up again. When she opened her eyes, she was under the quilt. It was! What she created in the wilder was created in life. Light. Wait. That meant the rattle for her baby cousin was really with her cousin. The letter to Gimp. Lil shook her head and smiled, even though the pain in her spine was still searing. Gimp really got that letter. Her little epiphany was ruined by the sound of oncoming curragh in the distance. They were roaring and snarling just loudly enough that she could hear them far away, closing on her swiftly. She dove back to the wilder. She raced into the air and made a cover for her hole, a big rock. She didn't think they would be able to reach her now, but then she realized there were at least 45 granting Munchin 5 at the most to have been able to kill. There might even be still 50. They could lift a rock. What could she do? Her body was laying helpless. She knew she couldn't move it because no matter how far she ran in the wilder, she would still have to go back to her hedges. She was trapped. Then a thought grabbed her, a thought so strange and terrific, so impossible, but she had to try. She flew, and flew hard from there east onto the zenith of the nearest mountain. She landed there and made a circle of hedges. It looked just like it should. Would it work? Could she have moved her body? She held her breath and stepped inside. Her eyes opened and she was staring at sky. It was still so cold and she still had the quilt on her, but the wind was blowing it off. Snow was falling in torrents and she was still in agony, but she was also not in the hole. Lil looked beside her, but the sword and foodstuffs were gone. She had only moved herself. She didn't care. She did it! Now to move herself somewhere less freezing. She could celebrate later. Once back, she flew over the mountain after mountain. She flew south away from Sheolam, which had looked like a great gray expanse even in the wilder. She hoped never to actually go there. Finally, she found fields, the Fertile Crescent. She made her circle and hoped she was alive.